folks. Welcome. If you ask 1,000 people walking down the street to define economic development, I would expect 900 of them to give you a funny look and walk on by. But the 100 who stop by would probably give you 100 definitions. Some people might focus on job growth and employment opportunities. Others might define economic development in terms of income and wages, and others might emphasize income equality. But it's not just random people who might have different definitions of economic development. Researchers have different ways of defining economic development too. In a book by Ron Schaefer and colleagues, they define economic development as the sustained progressive change to attain individual and group interests through expanded, intensified, and adjusted use of resources. I know this is a lot to digest, so let's break the definition into its parts. The first part, about sustained progressive change, suggests that economic development is an ongoing, continuous, and evolving process. The second part, about individual and group interests, suggests that economic development deals with people and things like their earnings and employment status, as well as the economic health of the entire community. That's what they mean by group interests. Finally, the last part, about expanded, intensified, and adjusted use of resources, gives clues about how Schaefer and colleagues think economic development is attained. That is, things like human resources, and this includes education, experience, and skills, and even natural resources are important to economic development. John Blair, in his book Local Economic Development, defines economic development as an improvement in the economic welfare of residents. Blair further elaborates that welfare can be measured in terms of real per capita income, an increase in equity, improvements in the physical environment, and even increased education. In my book, The Pursuit of Economic Development, I used elements from both of these definitions in my own description of economic development. I define economic development as a growth of good jobs in a region to improve the economic well-being of people and the places where they reside. Notice that the definition covers people and places. This is what Schaefer means by individual and group interests. And my definition suggests that job growth is a key to economic development. But it also sort of says that growth in itself is not a sufficient condition for economic development. Instead, you need a growth of good jobs. Just like everybody probably has a different definition of economic development, people also probably have different things in mind when they hear the term good jobs. But for most people, I don't think it's a stretch to assume that good jobs are safe, they provide reasonably high wages, perhaps stable employment over time, they don't harm the environment, a good job probably provides benefits like health insurance, perhaps full-time hours, and a good job is respected in the community. In a study with Jason Abel and Richard Florida, we used 4 characteristics of occupations to identify good jobs: hourly pay, the number of hours worked per week, with closer to 40 hours as the standard for a good job, whether or not a worker gets health insurance, and the job's level of prestige. More specifically, we used actual data on hundreds of U.S. occupations to build a job quality index. Again, the index is based on hourly wages, number of hours worked per week, health insurance, and prestige, and then we used the index to categorize jobs by job quality quartile. So you have occupations in the first quartile. This is the lowest ranking job to the 25th percentile. The second quartile, this is the 25th percentile to the 50th percentile, which is the median. The third quartile, this is the median to the 75th percentile. And then the top quartile of jobs, this is the 75th percentile to the 100th percentile, or the best job, according to these 4 characteristics. In our analysis, we were particularly interested in what happens to people with jobs in the first quartile of occupations. That is, are people able to transition from these low-quality jobs into occupations in higher quartiles? What we learned is that it's very difficult to move from a job in the first quartile to a better job. In fact, of the workers who started in a job in the first quartile of our job quality index, only about 5% transitioned into a better job. The most common outcome, and this represents 72% of the people we studied, is to stay in the exact same occupation. Also of note, 7% of the people in the first quartile of occupations became unemployed, so it was actually more common to lose a job than to transition into a better job. Just like the quality of a job can be described by a lot of factors, we can also use a lot of different measures to describe the economic well-being of places. Certainly indicators such as population and employment growth, the unemployment rate, income growth and levels of per capita income, and measures of income equality, and even the stability of local jobs are important to the economic well-being of regions. In my book, The Pursuit of Economic Development, I focused on 4 economic development indices. First, the employment index gets at the growth of regions. It is based on employment growth rates, and these are measured starting way back in 1990, and unemployment rates as of the mid-2000 teens. Second, the income index gets at the quality of jobs. The income index is based on the growth rate of per capita income, and these growth rates also start back in 1990, and also differences in income levels across places as of the mid-2000 teens. The persistence index is a second indicator of the quality of jobs in a region, and it's based on the idea that having stable employment opportunities is good for economic development. The persistence index is based on a measure of employment persistence, and I'll show you what this looks like in a moment, as well as a measure of how well regions recovered from the Great Recession of 2008. Finally, I combined the employment, income, and persistence indices to build an overall economic development index. And hopefully, it does an adequate job of measuring the growth of good jobs in a region. If you're curious, here's a list of the top U.S. regions for economic development based on my Economic Development Index, which covers a time period of 1990 to the mid-2000 teens. Overall, I looked at the economic development of about 380 U.S. metropolitan areas in all 50 states. And when focusing on metros, I separate regions into large metros. These are places with 1 million or more people as of 1990, and small metros. These are places with fewer than 1 million residents. Looking at the list of the top large metros for economic development, we see that San Jose, San Francisco, and several Texas regions, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, Denver and Seattle were the best large metros for the growth of good jobs starting back in 1990. As for smaller metros, the top performing places were Midland and Odessa, Texas, the Villages, Florida, Austin, Laredo, Texas, Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Bismarck, North Dakota. It's interesting to note that although Austin was a small metro back in 1990, it actually passed the 1 million person threshold for large metros over the period of analysis. So if I recalculated the economic development indices using data starting from a later time period, Austin would be counted among the large metros. The top states for economic development, again, this is looking from back in 1990 to the mid-2000 teens, were North Dakota, Texas, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Arizona. Although the rankings of the top regions for economic development are interesting, they only tell part of the story about the growth of good jobs across U.S. metros and states. As for the rest of the story, there was very high variation, just large differences, in the performance of regions over time. Here's a histogram that shows the distribution of metro area employment growth rates from 1990 to 2013. At one end of the spectrum, you have over 5% of U.S. metros that experienced a decline in employment over this 20-plus year time frame. At the other end of the spectrum, you have metropolitan areas with employment growth rates that exceeded 60, 70, and even 80%. Certainly, your view of the economy would differ if you lived in a region at either end of the spectrum for employment growth. We also find a large variation in the income growth rates of U.S. metros. Here, we're looking at the growth rate of real per capita income from 1990 to 2013, so the numbers are adjusted for inflation. At the low end of the histogram, you have some metros with less than 10% growth in per capita income over a 20-plus year period, while other places had a more than 50% increase in per capita income. Along with income growth, We also use data on employment stability to measure good jobs in a region. And as promised earlier, here's a figure that shows employment persistence. And by that I mean very low persistence, to show you what I mean by employment stability. This figure shows monthly employment in Ocean City, New Jersey from January of 2000 to the end of 2007. And you see very pronounced monthly spikes in employment during the summer, and then local jobs decrease in the fall and winter. This is what I mean by low employment stability and low persistence of jobs. Of course, this is easily explained by the fact that Ocean City is a popular summertime tourist destination. So you have lots of visitors during the summer months and a corresponding increase in local employment. But then, every fall, the number of tourists declines. This is what I think Don Henley meant by nobody on the road, nobody on the beach. And many jobs disappear with them. Hopefully, after watching this video, you have an idea of how you would define economic development in case someone ever stops you while you're walking down the street. You might tell someone that economic development is a growth of good jobs in a region to improve the economic well-being of people in the places where they reside. A second important aspect of economic development is that growth is often an input to development, but they're not one and the same. In fact, a region could experience employment growth, but not an increase in economic well-being. So here you have growth, but not a growth of good jobs. A final aspect of economic development that you might mention is that there's wide variability across U.S. regions in the growth and development experienced over the years. In other videos, we're going to try to explain this variation and figure out why some regions had an improvement in economic development while others did not.